Hello again, Biology 182 lab students. Today we'll be discussing Lab 38, Phylum Mollusca Annelida, which is on page 411 of your lab text. The objectives for this lab are to describe how structures specific to mollusks and annelids help them survive in the environment and promote their evolutionary persistence. Describe the general morphology of these organisms in both phyla, Mollusca and Annelida. List the characteristics that phyla Mollusca and Annelida have in common with phyla Platyhelminthes and Nematoda. Discuss those characteristics unique to mollusks and annelids newly derived from their ancestral phyla, and list examples of the major classes of mollusks and annelids. On our first slide, we can see at our top left picture a beautiful nudibranch sea slug. We'll get into those a little later. In the top middle, we can see our common earthworm. In the top right is a medicinal leech. In the bottom left, we can see a slug. And then a slug with a shell is known as a snail. And a bristleworm off to the bottom right. These are all examples in the phylum Mollusca and Annelid. I do have a joke. I really enjoy it. I hope you do too. What did the snail say on top of the tortoise shell? Whee! Looking at Mollusca and Annelida, there are some points and questions I want you to keep in mind throughout this lecture. Number one, to understand how body structure promotes survival, so I'm referring to adaptations for eating, defense, and reproduction. Two, what ancestral characteristics do mollusks and annelids share with phyla Platyhelminthes and Nematoda? Three, what are the new derived traits of these two phyla? Four, I want you to differentiate the four classes of phylum Mollusca. Five, differentiate the three classes of phylum Annelida. 6. What is the difference between the body plans of an acoelomate, pseudocoelomate, and a true coelomate, and which is seen in each phylum covered thus far? Derived characteristics are newly acquired traits, to be precise in definition, and ancestral characteristics are those that have existed over the long evolutionary lineage of the organism. For example, hair is an ancestral characteristic of primates, and opposable thumbs is a derived characteristic distinctive to primates. Think of it as a new trait that branches from the organism and its ancestors. Derived characteristics, to be clear, traits that are different from the ancestral condition, and ancestral characteristics, inherited traits, unchanged from their ancestors. In summary, mollusks and annelids are invertebrates, coelomate animals that lack skeletons but gain structural support and leverage for movement from hydrostatic pressure. What that means is we're taking, say, a leather balloon and inflating it with water. And as you know, a highly pressurized football or basketball can be a hard structure, and in this case these organisms use that as a hard object for muscle attachment and locomotion. These soft-bodied animals defend themselves in various ways that include living in a shell or producing distasteful compounds. Mollusks that are soft probably evolved from a worm-like ancestor into the second most diverse animal phylum. All members share three main body regions: the mantle, foot, and visceral mass. Most are detritivores and herbivores, although many bivalves filter feed, and cephalopods are advanced predators. Annelids, which means ringed segmented worms, show advancements including internal compartmentalization and closed circulation. Fanworms and leeches are aquatic. The former filter feeds with highly branched extension, while leeches are mostly predators. Let's take a look at the ancestral traits of mollusks and annelids. Well, they're eukaryotic. Makes sense, they have a nucleus in their cell. 2, they're heterotrophic, so they're going to eat on things rather than making food for themselves. Except for one newly described species of sea slug that lives in the North Canadian waters that has a special ability to make chlorophyll. It has the genes for it. However, the only way that this gastropod can get a hold of these genes is by eating algae. And it disintegrates the cell membrane and nuclear membrane and absorbs the DNA from the algae and incorporates it into its own genome and then can make chlorophyll and chloroplasts. Now, although there are many other mineral requirements for this animal, given a 12-day night cycle, this animal can live more than a year without eating anything. So there's a factoid for you, almost autotrophic. Number 3, true tissues. Number 4, bilateral symmetry. Number 5, a complete digestive tract. 6, organs and organ systems. 7, they possess movement or locomotion. And 8, they're triploblastic. Keep in mind, coelomat animals have the most advanced body plan. It's conserved in evolution of all subsequent animal lineages. Looking at our phylogenetic tree again, you can see our ancestral colonial choanoflagellate at the bottom that gave rise to our sponges, and our eumetazoans with true tissues. And that gave rise to radiata, which are jellies and comb jellies, and then bilateria, which gave rise to our acoelomates that don't have a body cavity. Those are flatworms that we previously studied, and then body cavities. And those organisms gave rise to two groups, the pseudocoelomates. So they have a body cavity not enclosed by a mesoderm. Those are the rotifers, nematodes. And then we have the true coelomates. They have a body cavity enclosed by a mesoderm, and we have three major groups of those: the protostomes, the leucophorates, and the deuterostomes. But we're going to be focusing on the protostomes, and in particular, the mollusks and annelids. What that means is they have a coelom derived from cell masses, whereas deuterostomes have a coelom that is derived from a digestive tube. Let's discuss what true coelomates are. The most advanced triploblastic body plan, meaning having 3 cell layers in development. Coelomates have a body cavity surrounded by a mesoderm, which is derived tissue. There are 3 advantages to this. 1, increased body size. The cavity circulates substances around. And an important thing for mollusks, which lack vessels, veins and arteries such as we do. 2, it's for increased mobility, more flexibility due to a hollow body cavity. And 3, the fluid cushions the organs like pads protected from impact injuries. A pseudocoelomate has a false hollow that's a liquid-filled space in which many of the external and internal organs are suspended. Crude body control because of the pseudocoel only has muscles on its outside. A true coelomate with a true body cavity within the mesoderm, enclosed on the inside and out by muscles. Coelom is a cavity lined with epithelium derived from mesoderm. Organs formed inside the coelom can freely move, grow, and develop independently of the wall, while fluid cushions and protects them from impact or shocks. A note to keep in mind, these 3 advantages also apply largely to animals having a pseudocoelom cavity, but the latter has less coordinated movement due to fewer types of muscle that are only capable of simple longitudinal contractions or side-to-side movements. Taking a look at our diagrams, we can see at the top right, we have our flatworm that has a stiff body. It has a body covering from the ectoderm. We have a tissue-filled region from the mesoderm, and then a wall of the digestive cavity from the endoderm. In our middle diagram, we can see a body covering from the ectoderm, a muscle layer, and then the digestive tract, and we have surrounding it a pseudocoelom, which is not a true cavity. But the coelomate body plan, at the bottom, you can see that we have a body covering, and we have a digestive tract, and just on the outside of that, we have an enclosed coelom, enclosed by a mesoderm. And that is tissue lining the coelom and suspending its internal organs. Now, this organism with a true coelom can fill that coelom with water or fluid and making it very hard as a rigid structure we talked about for muscle attachment. Now let's move on to the phylum Mollusca, which are snails, clams. Octopi is a less accepted plural form of octopus, which is the more accepted form is octopuses. Octo is a Greek-derived term meaning 8, and pi is a Latin-derived term. We typically don't put those together, so it tends to be octopuses, although it's subjective and you can call them whatever you want. They're the second largest animal phylum, with over 110,000 species described. They're marine, freshwater, and terrestrial. As we know, snails live on land, and we have snails inside the water, in lakes and in oceans. Mollusca means soft-bodied. There are 4 classes: Polyplacophora, Gastropoda, Bivalvia, and Cephalopoda. There are 3 main body parts, as we mentioned before: a mantle, foot, and a visceral mass. We'll see that on the next slide. And their defense: they have shells or a distasteful secretion on the skin, and they have open circulation, except the class Cephalopoda. Blood bathes in organs and sinuses and then returns to the heart, or multiple hearts in the case of squid. In the top right picture, you see a slug. It's totally barren. There's no shell, so it must have something that deters predators, and he tastes bad. In the bottom left hand, we can see some very large snails, and a chitin below that, which is a marine mollusk. And we have an open circulatory system diagram here in that middle diagram. We can see that they have heart, pericardial sinus, and gills. And then on the bottom right, showing the difference between an open circulatory system and a closed circulatory system, blood is always retained in vessels in our fish there. The mantle is a specialized layer of epidermal cells that secretes the shell, and it can aid in respiration. Many different external shells, some only remnant of an internal shell, and others have no shell at all. The coelom, often reduced in a small chamber surrounding the heart. As we suggested, they have open circulatory system, so blood pools in the sinuses and bathes the organs directly, rather than having capillaries that penetrate inside of an organ. They have few large vessels and a heart, but no smaller vessel and capillaries. The body plan shows little segmentation, but consistently includes 1, the visceral mass, organ systems, and that's for digestion, excretion, and reproduction. They have a foot, and it's ventral, highly modified muscular tissue, typically used for locomotion, and a shell that's calcium-based, or calcium carbonate, and a mantle that secretes the shell that may aid in respiration and locomotion. Some also have a differentiated head, snails having very elongated stalks for the eyes to attach to. Taking a look at the 3 body parts of a mollusk. 1, we have a foot, a muscular component of the body for locomotion, and it's highly modified in each class. 2, we have a mantle. It's a modified epidermis that produces gills and respiration, and secretes a shell in some species. And then there's a visceral mass, a collection of organs used for digestion, excretion, and reproduction. Let's take a look at our bottom diagram there. We can see the visceral mass is a very large portion. We see the mantle highlighted in blue. And then we can see the foot, which is highlighted in beige. This is of a snail, so we can see there are nerve cords, of course, running into the foot, controlling locomotion. We have a gill in the back. We have an anus that is connected to the intestine, the stomach, and of course the esophagus, and then the mouth. And at the tip of the mouth, in the bottom right picture, we see has a radula, which is a very spiny, hard, raspy tongue-like structure that allows a snail to lick off algae, in the case of marine aquatic snails. We can see the coelom that is enclosed around the heart. And of course, they have gonads, just like any other organism, and a shell on the outside. Many have the radula, the rasping tongue used to scrape off algae off rocks. And we can see a video of hot radula action. Let's look at the class Polyplacophora, which are the chitins. which means many plates. Well, in the top left picture, we can see that this one is black. Well, that would denote that they're going to come out in a dark environment. So that's why this one is a nocturnal scavenger, feeding on algae. There's a video there that they move in the intertidal zone, and they're very slow moving. Their foot is incredibly strong to adhere to rocks within the intertidal zone, experiencing many forces, more than several newtons, pushing and pulling on their shell. They're the most primitive living mollusk. They've been around since the Devonian and Ordovician periods, 400 plus million years ago. In the bottom left, we can see a brightly colored one. We can see the segmented chitin shell on the back, and then that blue ring around it is his foot. In the top right, we also see the same body plan, a segmented shell-like structure with a red foot on the dorsal side. And then we can see on the right, the bottom right, those dorsal plates as I mentioned, and on the ventral side we can see that there's the foot and a mouth with that radula. Now their defense is to live in these intertidal zones where there are many rocks, and as I mentioned, many forces incurred by the ocean as it slams back and forth, making predators less inclined to go into these for fear of damaging their bodies. Further looking at class Polyplacophora, they're exclusively marine. So we only find them in intertidal rocks. They're nocturnal and slow-moving because lakes typically don't have as strong of wave systems as the ocean does. That is why they don't typically live in lakes. They have 8 calcareous dorsal plates. Calcareous referring to they contain calcium. They're mostly herbivores. They use a radula to scrape algae off of rocks. Their reproduction is external, and their gametes are released into the water and unite. And then their gas exchange is through gills attached to the mantle. Radula means horny-toothed. It's an organ in the mouth. They feed on not only algae, but bryozoans, diatoms, bacteria, and other invertebrates. We can take a look at our diagram there of one. We can see the radula, we can see the foot, we can see the anus, the mantle, and the shell, and the gut. And then to the bottom right, we can count 8 dorsal plates that are what makes the chitins unique. Now let's take a look at the class Gastropoda, or some people pronounce it Gastropoda. What that means is a stomach foot. So it is true, their foot is on their belly. If we take a look at the top left picture, you can see some slugs dine on fungus. In the top right picture, there are brilliantly colored sea slugs called nudibranchs, which means naked lung, and at the top of that organism we can see its gill system there exposed to the environment. Those naked gills are feathery extensions for which the nudibranchs are named. In the bottom left we see another nudibranch. Nudibranchs sometimes eat cnidarians and store their stinging cells for defense and appendages on their backs. So those nematocysts can be used for their defense. There's a video there I encourage you to check out on swimming and crawling sea slugs. The middle picture there is of a snail, and of course the snail shell following the Fibonacci sequence. And in the bottom right we see eye stalks with eyes that sense light on slugs and snails. Further looking at class Gastropoda, the snail slugs and nudibranchs, they are the most diverse class, with over 85,000 species described. They are the only mollusk to successfully invade land. So snails and slugs that are on land have one lung to breathe, called a nematostome. They have mucus around their bodies that protect against water loss and predators. They have snail gut torsion, so a spiral shell that creates a U-turn. And then gas exchange, we see in gills or lungs. They have internal fertilization, and some are hermaphrodites. In the bottom left picture we can see a banana slug there with a nematostome opening. And then there's a video I encourage you to check out on slug mating, quite a beautiful video. There's a conus snail that lives in the ocean that has a harpoon which it used to hunt fish and can also be injected into human epidermis, and some can be quite lethal. In the bottom right picture, we have a picture of that U-shaped gut. So we have our radula, our U-shaped gut, and then our anus. The question is, does it poo on its head? And it may actually do that. We see its foot and its mantle. We can see in the right middle picture, the eggs are deposited spirally. It seems that the Fibonacci sequence not only plays a role with their shells, but also how they lay eggs. Gastropods have often a single shell that is often coiled and elaborate. The spiral growth is common in mollusks and results from unequal growth of the two halves of the larva and the mantle. Nudibranchs and common garden slug do not produce a shell. So what's an evolutionary advantage to being hermaphroditic? And then, of course, we talked about the radula. They do possess a radula, which they scrape. The radula in the cone snail has been modified to be somewhat like a mandible. For your information, terrestrial and freshwater snails in Arizona. We do have quite a few. We have spring snails that are threatened by water depletion and pollution throughout the Mogollon Rim. Many are restricted to single springs, canyons, or mountain ranges. There's a website there I encourage you to go to explore more about the spring snail. We have some pictures of them. In the top left we see a shell. In the top middle, the actual spring snail. In the top right, an abundance of shells, which would denote to me a pollution disturbance. In the bottom left, we can see that they do come out onto land. In the bottom middle picture, we see some shells from a different species of helix genre. And then to the bottom right, we also see the adult inside of the shell. As we move into class Bivalvia, which means two valves, including the clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. In the top left, we can see a picture of a clam, and the thing to notice are those little blue dots inside of the shell on the mantle. Those are eye spots that actually sense light. One thing to note about bivalves is they have no head, a radula. That's because they filter feed. So they will pump in water from one opening into the siphon, and then they have an excurrent siphon, which they pump out water once it's been filtered. In the top right picture, we can see a very large, giant clam, which can reach several hundred kilos in weight, including their shell weight. In the bottom left, we can see the top and bottom shell halves, commonly collected on beaches, and they're mostly sessile, but in extreme scenarios, like scallops, can swim very fast. And of course, in the bottom right picture, that is showing that many people enjoy clams and scallops as a delicacy. Further looking at class Bivalvia, one thing to note is there are freshwater species and marine. If we go to Lake Mary, in the upper Lake Mary, we can find freshwater clams. They have a hinged shell with two valves, and it clamps shut to avoid predators, very tightly in some cases, and can only be opened by things like sea stars. They have strong adductor muscles, meaning they're going to pull those shells together. They have external fertilization, so the gametes are released into H2O, and they are fused. They are filter feeders, so they have siphons, hence their name, and they direct H2O over the gills, which trap food and particles inside the mantle cavity, and then are collected and put into the stomach. They have internal gills, and they have a foot that is good for digging, so many clams can poke out their foot and dig into the substrate. And we can see in the bottom left, there is some types of algae that form a symbiosis with clams and can generate sugar from photosynthesis, thus feeding the clam, and then it is protected by the clam. So that's how the mutualistic relationship works. The shell is dorsally hinged, and the mantles of the left and right halves join posteriorly to form a ventral incurrent siphon and a dorsal excurrent siphon that direct water through the clam. The space between the mantle and the visceral mass is called the mantle cavity. Water flows into the mantle cavity through the incurrent siphon, and then puts it over the gills attached to the mantle. Food is filtered by cilia and then moved to the labial palps that direct food into the mouth. Filtered water and waste then exit the organism through the excurrent siphon. Nephridium are used to process waste. So taking a look at our bottom right diagram, we can see many of the things that I mentioned earlier. We can see the adductor muscle. We can see a digestive gland that is, of course, around the stomach. We can see a heart, another adductor muscle. Keep in mind it is a ring, so we're cutting that ring in half. We can see there's an anus, and we can see the incurrent and excurrent siphons there. We can see there's gills for respiration and nephridium. There's a long intestine, and surrounding the intestine are the gonads. Of course, there are ganglion to control these muscular movements, especially of the foot. So we can see we have ganglion by the adductor muscle and the foot. Of course, there's the shell and the mouth that actually takes those particles collected by the cilia, and the mantle itself. So there's an overview of the internal anatomy of a bivalve. In oysters, one of the questions that many people have is how are pearls made? Well, it starts out with a sand granule. Did you hear that noise? That was Mr. Pippins being lazy and doing his typical sound. Sorry about that. Mr. Pippins, can you just be a little bit quieter, sweetheart? Thank you, puppy. As I was saying, a sand granule moves its way into the mantle, and then, because sand, being made out of silica, an amorphous crystal, is many times sharper than any knife made out of metal, the clam or oyster will surround that very sharp sand crystal and begin developing a pearl. So the sand grain becomes stuck in between the mantle and the shell, irritating the animal. The mantle responds by depositing layers of crystalline shell around the sand grain, and then 3 years later, you have a pearl. So they take very long to develop. And if you cut a pearl in cross-section, we can see many layers of those crystalline shell that have been produced around that sand grain. Now looking at class Cephalopoda, which means head, foot in Latin, we can see an octopus in the top right corner, and those tentacles of his, all 8 of them, are from a foot that has been modified into tentacles. These are the largest, brightest, and fastest of invertebrates. In the bottom left picture we see a Humboldt squid, commonly known in Mexico as the red devil, or Diablo Rojos. They can move upwards of 3 or 4 meters per second, and they move by jet propulsion. Octopus can swim using their tentacles, but they also use jet propulsion. The nautilus there in the bottom right picture has a very large shell, and is one of the oldest known cephalopods. There's only 6 species extant, and not much is known about them because they move up and down in the water column and go very deep, sometimes thousands of feet into the water. They also move by jet propulsion out of their excurrent siphon. We can see that very large eye in the octopus, squid, and nautilus, one of the most developed eyes in the invertebrate world. Further looking at class Cephalopoda, which means head, foot in Latin, they lack shells, they have a closed circulatory system, and that's the only mollusk that has a closed circulatory system. Closed circulatory system means that blood is contained in vessels. Something odd about their blood, which is much like the horseshoe crab, their blood uses magnesium as their oxygen-carrying atom, and oxidized magnesium is blue. So, cephalopods have blue blood. The giant squid has the largest eyes in the animal kingdom, even bigger than the blue whale's eyes. Cephalopods are characterized by having a bilateral body symmetry, a prominent head, and modification of the mollusk foot into tentacles, using a muscular hydrostat for anything between chewing and locomotion, and use chromatophores, which are pigment-containing and light-reflecting cells found. We find them in amphibians, fish, reptiles, crustaceans, and cephalopods. They are largely responsible for generating skin and eye color in cold-blooded animals or ectothermic animals, and generated in the neural crest during embryonic development. Mature chromatophores are grouped into subclasses based on their color, more properly hue. Under white light, xanthophores make yellow. Erythrophores make red, iridophores make reflective or iridescent colors, leucophores are white, melanophores are black and brown, and cyanophores make blue. The term can also refer to colored membranes associated with the vesicles found in some forms of photosynthetic bacteria. Cephalopods, such as octopuses, have complex chromatophore organs controlled by muscles to achieve this, while vertebrates, such as chameleons, generate a similar effect by cell signaling. So it's a little slower in chameleons. Such signals can be hormones or neurotransmitters and may be initiated by changes in mood, temperature, or stress, and visible changes in the local environment. Like chameleons, cephalopods use their physiological color change for social interaction. They are also among the most skilled at background adaptation, having this ability to match both the color and texture of their local environment with remarkable accuracy. In laboratory experiments, octopuses can be readily trained to distinguish between different shapes and patterns. This has been reported to practice in observational learning, although the validity of these findings is widely contested on a number of grounds. Octopuses have also been observed in what some have been described as play, repeatedly releasing bottles or toys into a circular current in their aquariums and then catching them. Octopuses break out of aquariums and sometimes go into other aquaria in search of food. They have even boarded fishing boats and open holds to eat crabs. There's 1,000 marine species known. They developed in the late Cambrian, 600 million years ago. We find fossils of them, especially the nautilus, leaving behind their very hard shell. The foot is modified into tentacles with suckers. Again, they have a closed circulatory system. They have an internal shell, and in the case of squid and octopuses, they have a pen. But in the nautilus, we see that they have an external shell. They exhibit a great deal of parental care, taking care of their egg masses. And they have no skeleton, and they change color, as we mentioned before. Adaptations for active predation. They have advanced cephalization, so they have a very large head. Most intelligent invertebrates. They can open jars. The largest brain to body mass ratio. They have a complex eye with a lens, much like the vertebrate eye. And we discussed chromatophores, which gives rise to camouflage. And they have statocysts that sense and sound and gravity. And of course they have their X-current siphon for jet propulsion. Some of the adaptations for survival that octopuses, squid, cuttlefish, and nautilus have. First of all, of course, they exhibit a great deal of camouflage. As we mentioned, their chromatophores really help with that, but they can also change texture. There's a video of that I encourage you to check out. Again, there's another video on color change. 2, they can autotomize limbs, which means they can be cut off and then they regrow. So if a predator latches onto one of their limbs, the predator can bite off the limb, the organism will get away, the predator has somewhat of a meal, and then the cephalopod will grow back that lost limb. They have ink in an ink sac, and it's released to escape sharks, and has a dulling smell. So it absorbs the smell of the octopus, and then the octopus can get away. And not only does it absorb the smell, it's very dark in color, so the shark can't see. They have venom in their saliva, in octopuses especially. So some octopuses, like the blue-ringed octopus, the bottom right picture, they have venom that could kill 26 human adults in minutes. There's a video there I encourage you to check out about that. And of course, with no bones, or no exoskeleton to speak of, they are compatible, and they can hide in tiny, tiny spaces. Needless to say, octopuses are not claustrophobic. Now let's look at the phylum Annelida, which means ringed segmented worms. 1, they have a coelom, true coelom, and a triploblastic body plan. 2, they have complex organ systems. We'll see that on the next slide. 3, they have true body segments, repeated sections divided by septa. What this does is divide the labor, or work, of each segment. Not only the work of locomotion, but circulatory, digestive, and excretory. 4, they have a closed circulatory system. 5, they have a complex brain ganglia, not to be confused with a brain that we are familiar with in humans. They have setae, which are bristle appendages for different uses, some swimming, some burrowing. And setae modifications distinguish the 3 classes. So we have several different classes. In the top right, we have an earthworm. In the bottom left, we have a bristle worm. And we can see the setae are a little longer. Another bristle worm next to that. You can see the entire body plan. A fan worm, or tube worm, commonly known as feather dusters. And in the bottom right, we have a leech, which we don't see any setae at all. We can see the diagram of the basic anatomy, which we'll get into. You can see metanephridium, nephritiopores, the coelomic fluid. You can see that it produces urine. It has capillaries because it has a closed circulatory system. It has a bladder, nephrostome, and a collecting tubule. Now let's dig into the systems of annelids. 1, we have a muscular system. 2, we have a digestive system. 3, we have an excretory system. 4, we have circulatory system, which is closed. 5, we have a nervous system with a simple brain ganglia. And 6, we have reproductive system, and they are hermaphrodites, although they do perform sexual reproduction. And they have respiration through their moist skin, so that's why we find them in aquatic or fossorial habitats. Note how the body is divided into segments by partitions called septa. You can see septa there on our bottom right diagram. Many organs repeat organization in each segment, such as the excretory and circulatory organs. So we'll see capillaries and the bladder repeat itself in each segment of the worm. Now what this does for the worm is, it's quite a wonderful adaptation. If the worm is cut off, then it has enough organs to regenerate that lost segment. Something we haven't seen. Many organisms in the mollusks can autotomize limbs, but not their main body segment. But worms, earthworms, can get away with it. Let's take a look at the digestive system of an annelid. There are 3 organs that are not repeated in the segments. So there's the pharynx, which is the throat, and that transports food, typically dirt in the earthworm, to the esophagus. And then the esophagus, using peristalsis, is going to move that food into the crop. Well, the crop is an enlarged cavity for food storage. Next to it is the gizzard, and that has a cavity. It's a cavity for digestion via enzymes. So birds also have gizzards, and they use it somewhat like a worm does, where they'll put rocks or pieces of sand to help digest. But in the case of the earthworm, the gizzard is used with enzymes. And then a very long intestine, used for absorption of the dirt that earthworms eat. And it's the longer the better for the earthworm, so that it can absorb the most amount of nutrients that it can. And then at the end, of course, we have the anus. Within the annelids, we have a few classes we'll be discussing. The first class is the Polychaetes, which means many bristles. These are aquatic worms. We can find them in aquaria, commonly known as fireworms. And they have poisonous bristles. If you touch them, that can actually irritate your skin. They're very good at swimming, using lateral or dorsally ventral undulations to move through the water. There's a video, the top left, swimming worm. Some of them are very brightly colored to denote that they have poisonous bristles or they are bad tasting. In the bottom left, we can see a feather duster worm, or a tube worm, that is also a polychaete, that makes a tube made out of protein and has appendages equipped for filtering the water. And those appendages we can see are orange in many tube worms. In the bottom right is a fan worm, a little bit different than a feather duster worm, the different arrangement of their appendages. And there's a video I encourage you to look at, the feather duster worm emerging out of its tube. Further looking at feather dusters and fan worms, of course, they filter feed, and it's the setae that actually allow them to filter feed. We can see in the top left picture, we can see those setae that are coming out that are branched and good at collecting particles within the water. In the center there, we can see the mouth parts. In the top right, we see a feather duster worm that is brightly colored. And that is because it is a bad-tasting feather duster. They hide from predators in the calcium tube. They secrete, so it's a mixture of flexible protein and calcium. The bottom is a picture storyboard of how the feather duster worm emerges. So we can see there's a worm inside the tube, and then its setae come out, and we can see them fully extended in the bottom right picture. Further looking at class Polychaeta, which again are the bristleworm, fanworms, and feather dusters, they're marine. We do not find these in freshwater ecosystems. They're sessile in a tube or free swimming. But sessile, meaning they stay with their tube. But if the tube is destroyed, the worm can find a suitable habitat and build a new tube. So they can move somewhat outside of the tube, but once they build it, they stay there. They have tentacles that sense vibrations. They have two pairs of simple eyes. They have body segments that have parapodia and setae. Parapodia are muscle-like projections that control the setae's movement. And the setae, the bristles that function in one movement, helping them swim, like paddles, defense, of course they can be poisonous, as we mentioned before, and filter feeding, such as the fanworms. The parapodia, they're foot-like appendages bearing setae which aid in swimming, of course, for locomotion, and respiration. They're highly vascularized. Setae in this class can be used to aid in filtering food and defense. Some species have setae which are filled with poisons that can be used against predators. Neresis are marine worms living in sediment. Parapodia have large surface area and are highly vascularized with blood vessels and help the polychaete move and respire. Protruding from the fleshy parapodia are many setae in which this class derives its name. Now moving on to the oligochaetes, which are the earthworms. They have few bristles. They're terrestrial and mostly detritivores, so they can filter dirt. They do not have parapodia, so that's what distinguishes them from the polychaetes. They have small setae for movement and friction. So while they burrow, they can use the setae to embed into the soil around them, pushing them along. They're hermaphroditic, so they have both male and female reproductive organs. They have something called a clitellum, which is a series of swollen segments. We can see a photo of that in the bottom right. And that joins the eggs and sperm in a mucus band and forms a cocoon. And that equals the external fertilization. And there's a video there on earthworm sex. 6, they're controlled by coelom movement. So they have a coelom, properly defined hydrostatic skeleton, and they can use it for extension, anchoring, and contraction. Here's a question I have for you. And thinking deeper, what advantage does being hermaphroditic provide to these animals? Motion of earthworms occurs by alternating contractions of circular and longitudinal muscles against that hydrostatic pressure, then the coelom, within each segment. Oligochaetes have a prostonium that functions like a kind of overlip priori to the mouth. Let's take a further look at the anatomy of annelids, especially the earthworm here. 1, the pharynx. That's for food suction and ingestion. Let's take a look at the esophagus. That's food transport. The crop is storage and some digestion, and then the gizzard is food maceration. As we talked about, they have enzymes within there. The intestine is for absorption of nutrients, ovaries to make eggs. They have a ventral nerve cord that have many ganglion along them in each segment. They have nephridium, which are white, small, convoluted tubules found on the inner surface of each segment. And their function, they're like kidneys. They have nephrostomes, which are ciliated, funnel-shaped, gather waste products and release through nephridiopores. And the nephridiopores are the actual site of waste exit. So, we talked about the pharynx, esophagus, crop, gizzard, intestine, ventral nerve cord, and they do have a brain, in quotes, which is cerebral ganglia. We're getting more increased cephalization, not like the cephalopods. And they have 5 hearts. They are pumping vessels throughout the animal to maintain a good blood pressure, or hemolymph pressure. Now let's discuss oligochaete locomotion. The first thing to note is they have two muscle types. It's not undulatory like we've seen in other worms, like roundworms. They use extension, anchoring, and contraction by alternating contractions of circular and longitudinal muscles against a hydrostatic pressure of the coelom within each segment. They have antagonistic movement of these two muscles, provide greater control. And coelomic animals have greater control of movement because they have both sets of muscles. Segmentation of the coelom allows the muscles of individual segments to move independently. Taking a look at our diagram there, we can see how those segments change from becoming larger in diameter to smaller in diameter, allowing movement of the organism against its own hydrostatic skeleton. Sexual reproduction in earthworms, they're hermaphroditic, so they both produce sperm and eggs. But the worms will find each other and intertwine to smear sperm onto the other's body. So they do reproduce sexually, although they are hermaphroditic. The clitellum slides along the body to pick up sperm and unite with eggs released into the clitellum, and there's your fertilization. They have fertilized eggs that are released into a cocoon and secreted by the clitellum. And there's a video there of a giant earthworm cocoon. In the bottom left, we see a diagram. So we see the head and we see the clitellum and how they just slide along each other. They rotate around each other to pick up the sperm to fertilize their eggs. This is interesting because this contrasts with other invertebrates and vertebrate groups that have parental care but have separate sexes. So after these eggs are fertilized, they're stored in a mucus band and released into this cocoon. We can see this cocoon in the bottom right picture, exhibiting some parental care, protecting the eggs from parasites and pathogens. How do earthworms increase surface area on the inside of their bodies for absorption? Well, what they can do is fold their intestine to something called a typhosole. So we can see our diagram there. We can see the dorsal blood vessel. We can see the gut, the longitudinal muscles, the circular muscles. But then we have this thing called a typhosole, which is a lengthwise folding in the intestine to double the surface area for absorption of nutrients. The last class within the annelids we'll be discussing are the leeches, class Hirudinea. Hirudin is the name of a chemical that's an anticoagulant found in leeches. Well, why would they need to have an anticoagulant? Some of them are freshwater ectoparasites, and many of them are predators of small invertebrates such as nematodes and insect larvae. In fact, there are no ectoparasitic leeches found in the state of Arizona or Utah. So if you find a leech that is on your skin, it is not an ectoparasite. It is using its posterior or anterior sucker to hitch a ride on you to get to one pond to the next. They have incomplete segmentation, unlike the oligochaetes discussed before, and they have no parapodia or setae. So remember that our polychaetes have parapodia and setae, our oligochaetes only have setae, and the hirudins do not have either. They have suckers, mentioned before, the anterior and posterior, to hold on to prey. They have flattened bodies versus the round oligochaetes. They're hermaphroditic, and they do have sex with a spermatophore, so they drop off a sperm packet, and another individual will come along and pick it up. Parental care, not all. There's a cocoon that is brooded, so we see in the bottom left picture of a cocoon. In the bottom right picture, we can see some leeches can get longer than 8 to 10 centimeters. And at the top right, we can see basic anatomy of leeches. So we see the jaws, the pharynx, the crop cecum, and the intestine. And then we have a posterior sucker along with the anus. Some leeches eat detritus and small inverts. One group of leeches, the glossophonids, have evolved the ability to care for their eggs and young. This care involves the pre-developmental investment, so it produces an egg yolk, and post-developmental care in the form of nutrient transfer, direct feeding, and other forms of care that aid in the survival of eggs and young. So there are some annelids that do take care of their babies. Of course, the medicinal leech is famed in microsurgery. So leeches can drain congested blood from a wounded site with high precision. Plastic surgeons use leeches in difficult grafts and reconstructive surgery. So it's less tissue damage than a hypodermic suction. We can see pictures there of the medicinal leech. In the top left picture, sucking onto someone's finger. We can see a doctor with a glove pulling it off an arm. We can see one in someone's palm. In the top right, we can see one that is used in plastic surgery. And then below that, of course, is a girl that seems to like to have leeches suck onto her face. One thing to note, medicinal leeches have been known for quite a while that they can actually filter the blood. So once they remove the blood, if they have an excess, they typically drop off, but they also clean it at the same time.